All right, well, thank you very much, and welcome to the fourth NYU Game Center guest lecture. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Marc LeBlanc. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you very much to the people who make the Game Center possible and this lecture series possible, the Rockefeller Foundation, Sharon Chang, and the TTSL Charitable Foundation, and other generous donors. Marc LeBlanc is a game designer and teacher who has worked in this industry for many years. He was at Looking Glass for a while, working on games like Ultima Underworld and Thief. He was at Sega for a while, working on sports games, on the 2K sports game series, I think working on, focusing on maybe artificial intelligence and things like that. He has recently been working at a company called Mind Control Software, where he worked on he designed the award-winning independent game, the IGF award-winning game Oasis. I know Marc for many years, and I've often been faculty at a thing he teaches at the Game Developers Conference, which is a game design workshop, in which is where I learned about the conceptual framework for game design that Marc developed called MDA. I think it's really useful. I think it's a fascinating way to think about the process of game design, and we're going to learn more about it and learn more about Marc and his work tonight. So, Marc LeBlanc, thank you.
Hey there. So I'm going to talk about this conceptual framework a little bit. It's called Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics, or MDA for short. This isn't going to work. All right, a little bit about me. I'm a computer scientist by trade and by training and sort of just by inclination. And computer science is all about these things called state machines. And a state machine is a thing that has your current state or your current situation, right? And it basically computes the future state based on a set of rules and also based on some user input. So, for example, those annoying phone trees that you have to go through to get your voicemail or get customer service from your favorite company are state machines, right? And really, people talk about computer science is really about computers. Really, it's about these things, state machines. And so, really, I like to think of games as state machines, right? And not just digital games, but all games are kind of state machines. Like if you can think about these two artifacts. And just imagine the, million years in the future, the alien architect, the alien archaeologist who's digging up our bones and finding these two objects, right? And they both have very spatial representations of their state. They both have rules by which you evolve the state forward into the future. And my question is would the alien archaeologist be able to tell which one of these was the computing device and which one of these was the recreational activity? And he might not. And so kind of the punchline is that on some level, game design is programming. Game design is about creating procedural systems, right, that sort of evolve forward over time. Both of those things have rules, right? The abacus has rules and the chess game has rules. And rule is kind of a tricky word. And we can have arguments about what a rule is. And really, when we're talking about rules, we're talking about sort of a larger concept, which is mechanics, right? And the mechanics really are everything that describes the system. It's everything kind of that comes in the box, right? Like whether your box has a disk in it, right? That code is the mechanics of the game. Or whether your box has a Monopoly board and a set of Monopoly instructions and and a little race car and a little boot, those are the mechanics of Monopoly. And we know a lot about mechanics, right? We have these whole encyclopedic libraries of mechanics, right? Card games have this vocabulary of mechanics that are specific to card games, right? With shuffling and trick-taking and bidding and the poker hands. And there's a few different mechanics that you just see over and over again. Like if you're going to learn a new card game, you're not going to be surprised that the cards get shuffled, right? You're not going to be surprised that you're dealt a hand of cards. You're not going to be surprised that hand is secret information. There's all these game mechanical things that are just sort of a common vocabulary in card games. Likewise, shooters, like first-person shooters, have things like, hey, there's always ammo pickups that you pick up, and there's always a couple different kinds of weapons, and there's always spawn points, and there's usually health pickups. There's almost always a rocket launcher, right? Like rocket launcher is part of our game mechanical vocabulary, right? And we can think about golf, right? If you think about a golf course, A golf course designer doesn't just like put a random pile of sand someplace, right? He always like digs a hole and puts the sand in the hole, because there's now a sort of standard vocabulary for making golf courses, right? And some of that is sort of just best practices, and some of that is also like a commutative vocabulary, right? Like the pile of sand would be surprising to a golfer. Quite typically, whereas the bunker is like a known concept that they sort of like know how to deal with, and they know what to do about the bunker. So mechanics is something we kind of know a lot about. And so as sort of, like I said, as kind of a computer scientist, the thing that I'm more interested in is what you might call game dynamics, right? And game dynamics is a word that kind of conveys dynamism. It conveys motion. It conveys something changing over time, right? And so I'm more interested in like what happens during a game, right? And you can think of the game, not just the players in the game, but the activity itself as being kind of a system that has behavior, right, by itself. And so one of the things that I'm curious about is like how games behave, right? And there's things we can learn. We know a lot about mechanics, but there's things that we can learn, and there's things that we actually know just from elsewhere in science, right, about how games behave, right? And here's one example. All right, so let's think about a racing game. Your Mario Kart, your Gran Turismo, what have you, right? And it's a multiplayer racing game, and let's imagine, or it's a sort of symmetric game where you have an AI, but the AI is a stand-in for a player that's playing by the same rules. Let's suppose we give the winner an arbitrary penalty to top speed. This is a common thing that happens in racing games. Sometimes it's an option, sometimes it isn't, right? Where if you're ahead, you just go slower than the guy who's behind. And this is sort of an arbitrary mechanism to keep the game close, right? Right. And that's a mechanic. That's just a rule, right? But the dynamics of it, the behavior that emerges from the system, is that the game is very close. And really, it's just a feedback loop, right? It's just a system, right, that measures the state of the game. There's a measurement step. OK, one guy is ahead. There's a decision. OK, the guy who's ahead has to be penalized, right? And then there's an action. OK, we're going to lower that guy's top speed, right? And this loop is happening over and over again very quickly, right? And that is driving the state of the game towards closeness, right? It's driving the state of the game towards the game being kind of a tight contest, right? And that's just a thermostat, right? That's just like a thermostat, which is measuring the temperature of the room. It's making a decision, oh, the room is too hot, right? And then it's making a decision about, and then it has actions it can perform on the room to drive the temperature in a particular direction. I've been using this slide for like 10 years, and I still love my little cooler that's just like a heater, except it has blue coils. I love that. My friend made that, and I'm kind of in awe of it. So this is an example of a feedback system, right? That drives the temperature of the room. It measures and changes its own state, right? So, and there's two kinds of feedback systems, right? There's the negative feedback system, which is the kind we've been talking about, where we're trying to drive converge the state towards a particular value. So we're giving the winning player a penalty to top speed, making the game close. We could also contemplate the positive feedback system, where we give the losing player a penalty to top speed, which will cause the game to snowball, right? Once you start losing, you keep losing, right? And so it's the first kind, the negative feedback system, is a stabilizing force, right? And the snowball effect versus the snowball effect. You can imagine taking that thermostat and crossing the wires. So when the house is hot, you turn the heat on, and when the house is cold, you turn the air conditioning on, and you come home, and either your house is burned down or it's frozen over, right? And that's a positive feedback system. And so feedback systems, okay, are a game dynamic. It's an example of a model, a rule, not a rule, but a model or a tool that we can use, a lens we can use to analyze games and understand their behavior a little bit better, right? And part of the idea behind a game mechanic is that it's kind of a game dynamic is that it's independent of the mechanics, right? We can have many different mechanics that produce this same kind of stabilizing or snowball kind of effect. And let's go through some examples. So in Mario Kart, here's another racing game, right? And Mario Kart, correct me if I'm wrong, I may have the wrong racing game, but there's little boxes that you can open to get items. Okay, that's good. And they're random items, but in fact, they're biased towards the losing player. Like there's better items and there's worse items, and in fact, there's a little bit of bias in the randomness, so that when you're behind, you get the cooler thing, or the thing that lets you shoot forward. that sort of helps stabilize the race. So like this is a case of a feedback system that's hidden by some randomness, but it's a feedback system nonetheless. We're making a measurement, we're making a decision, and then we're taking an action to stabilize the race. So there's a sort of a category of systems that video game developers talk about called dynamic difficulty adjustment, generally for single-player games, where basically, hey, look, we can measure the player's success and failure. Right? And we can retune our game on the fly. Let's make the enemies a little bit harder. Let's make or a little bit easier. Let's give you a few more lives. Let's spawn a few more power-ups. Oh, thank you. Those kinds of things. In order to sort of have the player's experience converge towards kind of some median level of success or failure. Right? And that's just another example of a feedback system in the single-player context. Right? So you can imagine sort of a fighting game that has a finishing move. And what I mean by that is specifically imagine a special move meter that fills up when you inflict damage, right? And so and once this meter fills up, then you can do the special move, which does a lot of damage, right? So this is an example of success breeding success, right? The more damage you inflict, the more opportunities you have to do this special move, right? And so this is another example of a positive feedback system that's destabilizing the game. And you can compare that to the Final Fantasy VII style limit break, where the meter fills up as you take damage, right? And then it's a stabilizing influence, right? And then we can talk about the Scourge Factor. Now, the Scourge Factor is an interesting case. Now, that's the case in a many-player game where someone pulls ahead, and then the rest of the players kind of gang up to take him down, right? Like the FU factor, right? So it has all those same states, right? Like the players are measuring, someone's winning. They make a decision to gang up, and then hopefully their decision has something within the game that they can do to actually gang up. Now, sometimes the game doesn't provide any kind of mechanism, but sometimes it does. In which case, like if there's like a team attack, a coordinated attack you could do on that guy. And that changes the game state. So this is a really interesting example because it's not an authored feedback system, right? It's not something that emerged directly from the rules. It emerged from player psychology, right? It's not something that any designer created. It's something that sort of human nature created, right? And so dynamics aren't just things that we author. They aren't just things that we embed within our game. They're things that emerge as part of our game's behavior. So another example of an emergent feedback system is this kind of idea of embarrassment of riches, where you can have a multiplayer game where the player who's doing better has more choices and thereby has more bad choices and has a harder problem to solve in order to maintain his level of optimal play and is more likely to make a mistake. Whereas there are lots of examples of games like that. There are situations in chess where, like, hey, the losing player just has to do what he does, and the winning player has to actually figure out what the right thing to do is. So again, we have this idea that we have a single dynamic that has many different implementations, right? So the dynamics, when we're talking about dynamics, we're talking about behavior. When we're talking about mechanics, we're talking about specific rules, specific systems, specific ways to describe what the game is. So when I'm talking about the aesthetics of games, dynamics is definitely something that I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in this question, which is sort of how do games make us feel? And more relevantly, sort of like what is the emotional content of a game? And part of this comes from sort of an acknowledgement that there's more than just fun out there. There's lots of different kinds of fun. There's lots of different kinds of players. And there's lots of different kinds of games to meet those audiences. So we need to think about more than just, oh, I liked it, so everyone's going to like it, right? If I made this game for me, then a million people are going to want to play it, right? And so, so one thing that we can talk about, we can understand aesthetics. One of the things we can talk about, one kind of fun we can talk about is drama, right? We can talk about, in drama, hey, guess what? We're in the middle of a film school, so I hope that people have seen this, right? The idea of a conflict that creates dramatic tension and tension that builds towards a climax. And you may argue with my shape there, but hopefully this idea is not new to anyone in the room, right? And so one of the things we can talk about is the way that tension is a function of uncertainty, right? A conflict is only tense if its outcome is uncertain, right? And for a game, what that means is it's as tense as it is close. or as it appears close. And I note that when I'm talking about uncertainty as tension as a function of uncertainty, uncertainty is necessary for tension, but is not sufficient for tension. There are other things. This isn't a talk on drama. Like, there are other things besides uncertainty that feed into drama, but certainly uncertainty is one thing that feeds into drama. Okay, well that's cool. That means that these things are related, right? Right? If a game is as tense as it is close, or closeness can create tension at least, and feedback systems can create closeness, right? Then we can use a specific model of dynamics, right, to help the player feel a certain thing, right? Like, so this is like a magic trick, right? Like, we can govern the closeness and thus govern the tension of our game, right? Oop, here I am. Okay. All right. Not on my own computer. So yeah, so this is kind of example of sort of the relationship between a single dynamic and a single aesthetic, right? There's more stuff going on. There's more kinds of behavior than just feedback systems, right? And there's more kinds of play pleasures than just drama, right? But this is just one example of one kind of behavior and the one kind of aesthetic principle that it evokes. And so again, much like with the dynamics and the mechanics, like, we can talk about that aesthetic of drama, and we can talk about lots of different dynamics that create it. And so I kind of think of as dynamics as evoking certain aesthetics, evoking certain emotional responses, much like dynamics emerge from certain mechanics. So I just wanted to run through some other examples of how you can create uncertainty or other dynamics that create uncertainty within a game. Right? Incomplete information just by itself. Hey, if you don't know everything, then you're uncertain. Randomness, like if you can't predict the future, hey, that's uncertain. And also complexity, right? If you can't predict the future because the task of predicting it is so difficult, right? That's another way. Escalation is a very specific form dynamic that creates uncertainty. And when I'm talking about escalation, I'm talking about the example is that show. Oh, I'm blanking on it. Jeopardy. Thank you. Jeopardy has 3 rounds, right? It has a round where you score points, and then a round where you score twice as many points, and then a round where you like wager all your points for the whole thing, right? So the neat thing about that is that the first round ends, it's sort of like halfway through the game or something. The last round's very short, but the first round is about halfway through the game. But halfway through the game, in time, we've only given out a third of the points, right? So it's this sort of illusory trick where time has passed and we feel like stuff has been resolved, but it hasn't been resolved as much as we think because we're gonna double the stakes later, right? So that's an example of maintaining the uncertainty by escalating the stakes. So I mean, the whole idea of double or nothing, right? Like creates complete uncertainty, right? You don't want to create complete uncertainty, right? So escalation is somewhere in between. Somewhere in between double or nothing and just nothing is this idea of 1.5 or nothing, or 1.5 or a half, for example. There's this idea of a potential barrier where imagine the example I use is American Gladiators. They have this contest at the very end, which is a winner-take-all race. How many people have seen American Gladiators? Know what I'm talking about? Okay, they have this winner-take-all race at the end. Whoever wins the race like wins the whole contest, right? And what they always do, and you can think about how how drama literally emerges, like that curve literally emerges from like altitude, right? Because you run along and then you get to the cargo net, and the first guy who gets to the cargo net climbs up slowly, right? And that allows the other guy to apparently catch up, right? In space, they've caught up. Like now they're only 5 feet behind. Of course, it takes to climb a cargo net 5 feet takes a lot of time, right? They haven't actually caught up in time, right? So now the players are closer together, right? Because of this potential barrier, this change in altitude, this change in the amount of effort required to get over the cargo net. And then, of course, when they get to the top, they invert it, right, and have the zip line, right? So, there's this building of tension as, oh, maybe he can catch up on the cargo net, maybe he can catch up on the cargo net, and then the front guy gets on the zip line, and no, he didn't, So, like, think about how there's gravity is like the motivating force that creates like this tension and denouement in American Gladiators. I think it's brilliant. Hidden energy. Hidden energy is the idea that victory costs you something. So imagine racing games are an easy metaphor to think about. Imagine a racing game where you have the turbo fuel that you can use, over time. You can imagine one player spending all of his turbo fuel at the front and getting way far ahead. And so in space, he looks like he's winning by a lot, when he's not winning by a lot because the other guy hasn't used any of his fuel yet. Right? So that's a case where the fact that the other guy has this resource, right, and maybe you can't see that resource, you can't see how much he has, like creates uncertainty. You don't know whether that guy's going to zip by you, even though in space it looks like he's further ahead. So those were just lots of examples of uncertainty created by different sort of behavioral dynamics, right? And so the complete framework is this idea of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And so as players, right, we sort of experience this in this causal flow, right, where hey, the game's sitting there in a box in a store. No, these days you download it, but it's sitting there in a box in a store, but humor me. You go and you buy it, you bring it home, and it's just a bunch of mechanics in a box, right? Or if you download it, it's just a bunch of rules in a file, right? And then when you start it running, or in the case of Monopoly, you pull the things out, you follow the instructions, you get some friends, and you start playing. And that creates this activity, right? And that is what can have the behavior, right? And it's only through that activity that you can actually have the fun, right? So this is kind of like the telephone wire through which the designer communicates with the player, right? We're over there making the rules, and they're over here having the fun, right? So just to be clear, why I'm using these sort of pointy-headed and academic-sounding words, it's so that we don't have to argue about whether, for example, gravity is a rule of baseball. Right? We can own the word and the word mechanics, and we can own the meaning of mechanics, and we can decide for ourselves, whether gravity is a mechanic of baseball. So by mechanics, what I'm talking about is the rules and concepts that formally specify the game as system. Everything you have to know to be certain that you're playing this game. Everything you have to know to be certain that you're playing chess and not baseball. Right? Those are the mechanics. Right? By dynamics, we're talking about the runtime behavior of the game as system, right? We're talking about what happens when you play, right? And by aesthetics, we're talking about just the desirable emotional responses evoked by the game dynamics, right? We're talking about what fun the player's trying to have. We're trying to have the player have. And we get past the word fun because, hey, we could make the catharsis game, right? We can make a game that's horrific, or something like that isn't fun per se, but has the aesthetic qualities that we want, right? And so MDA, mechanics, dynamics, essentially, is an intellectual framework. It's a way to conceptualize about games intellectually, right? It's a communication tool. If you're working on a game in a team, there are situations where you're going to be having an argument, right? And these are words that can help you, right, have the argument. These are that sort of sort out, even the best of us are like, I want this feature. No, that feature sucks. I want this feature. No, that feature sucks. And if you can step back and say, okay, well, what are our aesthetic goals? What are we trying to get out of the feature, right? Let's start with the aesthetic problem we're trying to solve, and then we'll see, what exactly is going to solve that, right? MDA is three different views of games. We're viewing games in terms of their sort of formal system definition, viewing games in terms of their behavior, viewing games in terms of their sort of play pleasures. And it's a top-level taxonomy, right? It's three words that can help you classify kinds of knowledge about game design: knowledge of mechanics, knowledge of aesthetics. Oh well, so much for. It isn't a process, right? MDA isn't a crank that you can turn that makes games, right? Like it's a tool that's orthogonal to process, right? Your process may start with mechanics. Your process may start with aesthetics. Your process may be highly intuitive and only fall back on MDA when you need it, right? It's obviously not a silver bullet, right? It isn't something that that substitutes for inspiration, right? You can't be an uninspired game designer and think that MDA is going to give you a career, right? And it's not a substitute for playtesting, right? You can't, intellectually theorize that this is going to be fun. Let's ship it. Don't bother putting it in front of any players, right? So in some sense, mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics isn't about mechanics or dynamics or aesthetics. It's about the arrows in between them, right? It's about, right? I spent sort of the first half of the talk talking about how this particular mechanic evokes this particular dynamic, or there's an emergence relationship between this mechanic and this dynamic, and how a particular dynamic evokes a particular aesthetic. And in some sense, that's where game design is. That's sort of like where the skill and craft of being a game designer is in finding and understanding these relationships between the particular little squares. And that's all I have.
So, have a seat. Did you? Oh, is there an extra water? I'm going to have this one.
Take that one.
So, thank you. That was good. That was a rollicking tour. Because I've heard the 2-day version of that lecture, and that was the 25-minute version of that lecture. Let me ask you a little bit.
I've heard the 10-year version of that one. So.
What are other examles of aesthetics?
What are other examples of aesthetics?
So you talked about drama. You talked about
Sure. God, you're going to put me on the spot now.
Well, I know
I have more slides.
You're famous.
Oh, here, I have more slides. So this was a talk I gave in 1999. Okay.
I've just been LeBlanc.
This is a version. This is a version of a talk that I gave in 1999, and so and I was a very the idea has evolved in 10 years, right? But feedback systems are a useful tool for creating drama in competitive environment. That was sort of my thesis of a 10-year-old talk, okay? And I gave this at the GDC 10 years ago. And this is kind of what they heard. And so, there wasn't a lot of, intellectualizing about games back then. And it was kind of hard to get past the idea of you could have a tool that wasn't a value statement. Right, and really, and one of the reasons why I wanted to start talking about aesthetics is to really get past the idea that not every problem is a nail, and not every tool is a hammer, and that you really are allowed to make games that that not all games appeal to everybody, and really everything is sort of scoped within the aesthetic purpose. But anyway, I wanted to skip ahead, because everyone asked me to recite this from memory, and I never can, and it's really sad. But
perfect.
So this is sort of a top-level stab at an aesthetic taxonomy that I did in 2000, and it really is kind of just trying to be a stake in the ground, trying to be something for anyone to look at and to maybe amend or extend or throw out, but just to motivate people's thinking about how to get past fun and get into a sort of richer vocabulary. And I kind of think of these as as sort of the phyla of the kingdom of fun, if you will, and that this is just the top level, and that there's other stuff down there. But anyway, narrative. When I'm talking about narrative in the middle there.
No, go.
Sorry, I got slides. I'm going to go. I'm going to go.
I have slides too. Can you look my slides?
Narrative, in this sense, I use kind of as a synonym for drama. I kind of mean the ability for the game to function as a story, right? If we think about movies like Breaking Away or Searching for Bobby Fischer that like end in a contest, right? That like there's a game embedded within the movie. That like the events of the game are narrative, right? And just that idea is narrative is like the ability of a game to function as to tell a story, not necessarily. To be a story, not necessarily to tell a story. But going to the top, like sensation is just the sensory qualities of a game, the ability of a game to like look nice or feel nice, sound nice or smell nice. Fantasy is the ability of a game to be about something, right? It's about flying a plane, or it's about a war between orcs and humans, or about being a pirate, right? Those things are sort of fantasy. Challenge is the ability for a game to give us sort of problems to solve, obstacles to overcome, ability for a game to test our skills, those kinds of things. Fellowship is all the social play pleasures. It's the ability for a game to be competitive, to be cooperative, be a framework for social interaction, to make it an excuse for trade, communication, all of those social pleasures I call fellowship. Discovery is the ability of a game to be a sort of uncharted territory for you to explore and discover. And there's kind of a cycle of discovery where you start out as a tourist and you're sort of wandering around. and eventually you start to know the lay of the land, and then you become a native, right? And first you start asking people for directions, and then you start being asked for directions, right? Discovery can be, is obvious in spatial spaces. Like, hey, when I'm playing World of Warcraft, I start in the newbie zone and I sort of learn the geography as I go. But you can also think of conceptual spaces like the tech tree in Civilization, or really just the strategic landscape of chess is something that you can explore and discover. Expression is just the ability for the game to be a soapbox to let you say something about yourself. And then submission is sort of this idea of the game just as raw pastime, just sort of like the game as a thing that sort of tells you what to do, and it's a system that you can participate in, kind of like the pleasure of sort of square dancing and following the instructions, or the pleasure of knitting, like the way that Tetris is like rearranging your bookcase, just the fun of like, oh, I'm cleaning, or that kind of thing, just submitting to the system and sort of being the pleasure of being a cog in the system.
Which of these aesthetics are the ones that you respond to the most as a player?
Oof.
So when you play games for pleasure, what are the types of games you play, and which of these kinds of things are you most interested in?
Oh God, I would say that I respond most to the challenge and the narrative aspects, a little bit the fantastical aspects. You're fooling
It's a weird
yourself.
combination.
I guess.
It's interesting, yeah.
Some of the social, it depends on the games, right? When I'm playing, when I'm playing German board games, I would say that the fellowship aspects are important.
Yeah.
When I'm playing, other stuff, it's Portal, not so much.
One of the things that you said at the beginning, which I think I haven't heard you say in quite this strongly, is that game design is programming. Game design is a kind of programming.
Right.
And it's something that I'm super interested in, and I always ask people about the relationship between games and computation.
Right.
As we're putting together this program and thinking about what it means to treat games as a subject of higher education.
Right.
It's important for us to establish that games are their own thing. They're an aesthetic form.
Right.
But at the same time, so they're not a subset of computer science. But at the same time, they have this really, really deep relationship, this kind of essential relationship to computers and computation. It's fascinating. You're a programmer, and so
that's what they pay me for anyway.
Right. Okay.
So.
But they pay you to design games as well.
Sure.
So in your mind, what's the nature of that relationship? How closely are those things connected?
Well, I think Jonathan Blow kind of said it best, which is that programming is the last mile of game design. Programming is, it is all game design implementation. When you finally get to the point where you are truly in the moment of implementation, right? Exactly, how many cards do you draw a turn? Exactly, what is the procedure for this stuff? Exactly what is the composition of, the card deck? Those things like that.
But it's also the first mile, the way you're presenting it in a way, right? Isn't it also kind of the deep well that we're drawing from? If you think,
sure, it's the well of behaviors. It's the well of system dynamics. So yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree.
So the other thing that's interesting to me is that you make a lot of references to non-digital games. It's clear that you see computer games and video games within this broad spectrum of games as a whole, right?
Sure.
That games as a part of culture that we've had for all time.
Right.
And now we're kind of turning up the light on them, and we're looking at them more closely, and they're becoming a bigger part of and we're thinking about them more as a kind of aesthetics and less as just not thinking about them at all. And yet they have this deep connection to computers. Some people think video games are something that just were invented recently.
Right.
And that's kind of their frame. But you think that no, their video games
no,
are
I really feel like all games have been waiting for computer. And that's sort of also a response to people who think that games are kind of a frivolous use of computers, right? It's like games have been waiting for computers for thousands of years, right? You know, they've always been. I mean, the reason why there's been this escalation, this almost singularity-like escalation of game development. Like now, game designer is a profession, not just in the digital space, but in the non-digital space, right? Like we know who designed, Magic the Gathering in a way that we don't know who designed, chess really, or Go.
Who knows in this room? Raise your hand if you know who designed Magic the Gathering.
I know one.
So some of us do, yeah.
Okay, all right. So
Richard Garfield.
there you go. Monopoly, anyone?
It was what's her name? It was originally the Landlord's game.
Okay.
Based off of it was a communist idea.
The single tax economic theory of L. McGee, or El McGee was the
George.
I forgot her name.
Was her?
but
That no, that was her.
Lizzie McGee.
Lizzie McGee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and,
Okay.
George
but
was
there-
the
but there's
guy.
arguments over whether or not she invented it or someone else. So there's the whole Monopoly.
There's not much argument. I think it's
Right,
I
yeah.
don't think it's historically.
There's different versions of it that
Right.
Parker Brothers ended up buying.
Right.
Because they didn't want to be a question of
But the canonical Monopoly, as we know it today, was
Lizzie McGee.
no,
I forgot.
Charles Darrow. Yeah,
That's it.
there you go. Trivia.
All right, so I'll say, okay, here's an interesting
But we
thought.
know that. We don't know who designed Senet. Now, all right, now, how many people know about the Egyptian game of Senet? S-E-N-E-T. Okay? Now, Senet was played for 3,000 years, okay, which is like, dwarfs the entire history of video games, right? Like, dwarfs almost the entire history of games, right? It was played for 3,000 years. And at the beginning, it was a recreational game, and at the end, it was like this sacred oracle, right, that could tell you like what was going to happen to you when you died, right? And and so, but we don't know who. It largely unchanged, to my knowledge, over those 3,000 years. But we don't know who invented it, right? Whereas modern, I mean, and it's not just we are better historians. It's that hey, computers have happened, and they've changed everything about how we think about making all kinds of games, right?
And so it's clear that that you see games as like capable of being a meaningful part of our lives, and they're worthwhile
Sure.
as cultural objects. They're
Right.
not just pastimes.
Well, I mean, I think play is a fundamental thing. It's a fundamental thing that we do that makes us human. Like being someone who plays is like being someone who's like completely. It's like being tone deaf to play. It's like, or being someone who doesn't play is like being tone deaf to play. I
Right.
should say. Yeah.
Right.
Like we're all, players, right, on some level.
So let me ask your take on this issue, because there is a you come out of Looking Glass. So we had Warren Spector last week.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting this kind of two angles on the Looking Glass diaspora, sort of.
Okay.
To see the different people that went in different directions.
Sure.
And I think your take on games just feels very different from his. He's
Sure.
very interested in narrative spaces, in rich simulated environments, in the experience that a player has that can move them emotionally as they respond to characters and situations and kind of ethical and moral dilemmas. And I think for him, a game like chess or basketball or football, I don't think he feels like he's making something like that.
Right.
I get the sense from you that you see a thread that connects a game like Thief or
Right.
Deus Ex to basketball and chess and golf and things like that. So I think for Warren, he sees that games are on this trajectory towards becoming something that can be really rich and meaningful as culture. To the degree that they're able to create these effects, the kinds of effects that we're used to getting from literature and film.
Right.
Whereas I feel like you do, and maybe I'm projecting it onto you because this is the way I feel. I feel like instead, games, sure, they can produce those effects, but they already produce these other effects, these other
Right.
kind of aesthetic qualities that are equally valuable
Right.
and can be equally meaningful.